web stream throughout the world.
Today's show and all programs will be archived at kmud.org and our program website, that is heroespatriots.org. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guests. 707-923-3911, 923-3911. We hope you will call in. We will take as many questions as time permits, and we do ask that you be brief. Our thanks to our KMUD engineer today, Dorothy Sakur, for assisting with the production of today's program. Views and opinions expressed during this program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, or volunteers of KMUD Community Radio. John, and I understand the things we're going to talk about today can be kind of controversial. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just want to get in a quick word about the term conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist. It's often used to just denigrate and to dismiss a credible theory about events. I had a friend, and he's actually the reason I got into public radio, Michael C. Rupert. Many of our listeners know him as being the former LA Police Department Gold Shield detective, who basically outed the CIA's complicity in drug dealing. He outed then CIA nominee John Deutsch at a Los Angeles City Council meeting. And then he went on to write the bestseller Crossing the Rubicon about 9/11 and did much great work before he was mysteriously found dead at his home not far from here in Calistoga.
Wow.
Mike's idea of conspiracy theory was the following. Everything is a conspiracy. The city of Eureka is a conspiracy. The county of Humboldt is a conspiracy. Your neighborhood, your family's conspiracy. This radio station it's conspiracy. Anytime two or more people gather, it's a conspiracy. So you can dismiss that part of the term conspiracy theory because everything is conspiracy. We live in a communal lifestyle, and everything is done with other people. The question is, what is conspiracy theory and what is conspiracy realism? Mike Rupert used to call himself a conspiracy realist. So as we proceed with the show today, keep that in mind. Mary and I are conspiracy realists. We're driving at the truth no matter where that takes us. Mary, take it away.
Thank you, John. And today we observe two important events in U.S. history. The 20th anniversary of the attacks on U.S. soil on 9/11 and the end of the 20-year war with Afghanistan. In this first half hour, we examine the false flag attack by the United States on the nation of Iraq with our guest, Dr. Graeme Macqueen. Shortly after the 9/11 events, the military-industrial complex cited evidence that al-Qaeda and foreign Muslims instigated 9/11. Further, the executive branch presented to us, its citizens, that these same foreign Muslims followed up 9/11 with the almost forgotten, John, domestic anthrax attacks just a week later after the 9/11 attack. Our guest, Graeme Macqueen, is the author of the book, The 2001 Anthrax Deception, the Case for Domestic Conspiracy. He began his research on 9/11 and the subsequent anthrax attacks in 2006. Professor Macqueen is now retired from Harvard's Department of Religion. He was the director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University in Canada. Dr. Graeme Macqueen, we welcome you to the program for the first time.
I'm very honored to be here, and it's an honor to be introduced with all those words of caution. So your listeners will know they're getting a dangerous guy.
Well, I have to confess that for the longest time, I did not believe 9/11 was an inside job, and certainly the anthrax thing, which is, as I mentioned, long forgotten. And it's disturbing. It's disturbing to think that our country had a hand in this. In your book, you state that the events of 9/11 and the anthrax attacks are, in fact, one and the same operation.
Yeah.
And you also talk about Dark Winter, a simulation of a military exercise using weaponized smallpox carried out 3 months prior to the 9/11 attacks or in June of 2001. Would you briefly describe Dark Winter and why your research shows it to be related to 9/11 and the anthrax mail attacks?
Sure. Maybe I should, if you don't mind, say a couple of introductory words.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just so people will remember. So about a week after the 9/11 attacks, letters started circulating which had anthrax spores, that is, spores of a deadly disease, inside the envelopes, usually accompanied by text, threatening text, which was clearly meant to have been written by Islamic extremists. I can read you one of those letters later, if you like. And initially, the first wave of these letters went out to the mass media, and people started to develop cutaneous anthrax from handling it, but it wasn't diagnosed yet. And then on October 3rd, finally, a man contracted pulmonary inhalation, that is, anthrax, which is much more deadly than cutaneous. He was diagnosed with this on October 3rd of 2001, and he died 2 days later. And so that's the big anthrax scare. And then letters continued to be sent. The second wave of letters went to 2 Democratic senators who were obstructing passage of the Patriot Act. It seemed that for some reason Al-Qaeda, I shouldn't laugh, but somehow Al-Qaeda didn't want anybody to obstruct the Patriot Act. So anyway, on it went. So I just say this to remind people what they were. They caused a lot of fear and anxiety for a while. The attacks were pretty much over by late October, and by the end of the year, the official story of Al-Qaeda in Iraq had collapsed, and everyone admitted, including the FBI and Homeland Security, that this was an inside job, and the anthrax came from within the military-industrial complex.
Right.
That's
and how is this related to the Dark Winter, for instance?
Right. Well, Dark Winter was a simulation. So when they do these periodically, let's do an exercise to see what would happen in the U.S. if we got a deadly bioweapon attack and how we would respond to that and so on. So this happened a few months before the anthrax attacks, and there were very high-level players in this so-called game, including a former FBI head and a former CIA head and a number of dark and shady characters. And they didn't use anthrax as their main bioweapon in the exercise. They used smallpox. Mm-hmm. But the idea was to see how devastating that would be for the U.S. and the world, and they all agreed solemnly that it would indeed be devastating, and that pretty soon people in the United States would be on their hands and knees begging for vaccines and drugs, and there would be civil unrest, and it might be necessary for the government to restrict people's civil rights and suspend habeas corpus and all this kind of stuff, really quite draconian. And then toward the end of the exercise, and remember, this is several months before the anthrax attacks, they finally
9/11.
They come to a conclusion as to who did it, and they say it looks like the on-the-ground foot soldiers were from a Muslim extremist group based in Afghanistan. In other words, that's the Al-Qaeda party, but they were supported by Iraq, and that's where they got the smallpox from. Now, the reason why that is such an important exercise is because a few months later, exactly the same story played out, except with anthrax. And by October 2001, we were told, well, Al-Qaeda provided the foot soldiers, and they sent the letters around, but they got the anthrax from, guess who? Iraq. And in this way, 2 very violent invasions were justified, and it was all fraudulent, of course.
Right, and this can be filed under the category of false flag attacks.
Yes.
And one has to ask, well, why? Well, there were 3 reasons, are they not? Almost immediately following 9/11 and the anthrax letter attacks, you had the U.S. Patriot Act being rammed through. You had the Homeland Security Act being rammed through. And people forget it, but you also had Congressional Joint Resolution 23, the authorization for use of military force, which authorized the president unilaterally to basically declare war, quoting the resolution, to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, persons, or organizations that he determines planned, authorized, or committed or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on 9/11 or harbored such organizations. 20 years later, we find ourselves exiting Afghanistan. Tie it all together for us, Graeme.
Well, yeah, I wanted to say something, although I'm not sure I can find it in my book right now. So I'll just sum it up for you. The authorization on the use of force that you just quoted was presented to Congress by Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. But in his autobiography, Daschle makes it claim that that's his revised version of the authorization, that the first draft of it was composed by the White House and was sent to him, I think, already on 9/11, and was an astonishing imperial statement. It didn't just say, that we can attack whoever we want once the president decides they were responsible for 9/11. It says we can attack those people for sure, but also we can attack any nation to deter and prevent them from launching a terror attack on us. And Daschle said, my God, they could use that to justify invading anybody at any time. So he managed to get it toned down before it was passed. I'm sorry that's not quite what you asked, John, but I wanted to get that in there. So back to your question, I'm sorry.
Anthrax letter case. I've done quite a bit of research on this, and also the FBI agent who was in charge of this investigation, a guy by the name of Vincent B. Lisi, who I think should be brought up on treason charges. This was a setup from the word go. There are so many holes in this case. It led to, again, the suspicious suicide of the
Bruce Ivins,
the leading suspect. Why don't you just look at the case forensically, the forensic evidence?
Well, it's complicated. After the Al-Qaeda Iraq hypothesis fell to the ground, and by the way, it fell to the ground because some honest scientists got a look at the anthrax spores, and they said, this isn't an Al-Qaeda or an Iraqi product. This is our own. It comes from a lab within our own military-industrial complex. So that's the first thing. So then what does the FBI do? Well, they're in trouble, aren't they? They've now got an inside job and a false flag attack on their hands, and there were some people killed in this, so it's a big deal. So they go looking for a lone wolf. Previously, it was assumed that this was a multi-party thing. Many people were involved. But suddenly, no, it's a lone wolf. It has to be some mentally disturbed person within the military-industrial complex. And once we find him, and they assumed it was a male, once we find him, we'll get him, and that'll be that, and it won't implicate any bigger institutions. So they find this guy, Bruce Ivins, who did have some mental health issues, but was also a very distinguished anthrax scientist at USAMRIID in Fort Detrick. And they rattle his cage for a long time, tell them they intend to seek the death penalty, talk to his children. I think they offered his son a new car or something if he would give evidence against his father. It's actually one of the tackiest things you can imagine. So they drove him to death one way or the other. If he did commit suicide, then it was because of the pressure they put on him. And alternatively, of course, they may have just killed him. I don't know. There was no autopsy. So the FBI framed him, essentially. I think it's clear that he didn't do it. Even when I wrote my book, the book came out in 2014, it was clear that this was a ridiculous case. They didn't find any anthrax on him. They didn't have any time or resources or skills for him that he could have done this. He didn't work with dry anthrax. He worked with wet anthrax. He didn't have the proper equipment at USAMRIID where he worked. All these things over and over again. And the FBI claimed there was this flask of anthrax which was the mother flask that produced the spores and the letters, and that he had exclusive control over it. Well, he didn't have exclusive control over it. It was accessible to all sorts of people. And it's an extremely weak case. The New York Times called it circumstantial. I would say it was very, very weakly circumstantial. And in my book, I claim there's no way any individual could have done these attacks. It was not an individual thing. It was a group, and they planned it in secret. And therefore, yeah, folks, it was a conspiracy.
Right. And you not only have you concluded that it was not a lone person theory, by the way, Bruce Ivins has supposedly had overdosed on Tylenol.
Right.
You also concluded that Iraq, foreign Muslims, or Al-Qaeda could not have been responsible for both 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. So who specifically did you find created the events leading up to and post 9/11? And what evidence points to those responsible? In your book, you talk about Judith Miller, who's with the New York Times, and James Woolsey, former CIA head. Would you like to name names for us?
I've been very careful not to say who actually did it.
I bet you
have. I've been pretty reluctant in my book to name names because no, it's not out of fear or anything. It's just very difficult to know when a specific individual is involved. For example, obviously someone in one of two labs, either Dugway Proving Ground, which serves the Army, or Battelle Memorial Institute, which serves the CIA, or both of them, they work together. There were obviously people there involved in getting these highly weaponized spores, but I don't know their names. There were also high-level people in the U.S. executive branch that were in some way involved, because they were giving all these speeches just before the Patriot Act was passed, haranguing the Democrats for taking so long and saying, we need to get this passed right away because we have a bad feeling that weapons of mass destruction may be on the way. This was before anybody had been diagnosed with anthrax. We have a bad feeling that biological or chemical weapons are about to be used, so you better pass this. Well, they were all involved in that. Cheney was deeply involved. Yep. He's the one that set the deadline of October 5th to pass the Patriot Act, and two Democrats frustrated him and made it impossible for him to meet that deadline. And they were Tom Daschle, Senate Majority Leader, and Patrick Leahy, head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And guess what? After the deadline was missed, they both got anthrax letters in the mail. So, so Cheney's involved, of course he is. Donald Rumsfeld, I gather he's dead now. He was involved. He's one of these people out there making these public statements. John Ashcroft, all these people, but I can't tell you their exact role. Sometimes there are dark players behind the scenes who hand these people talking points. And so sometimes, for example, George W. Bush himself, how much did he know? I have no idea. They may have protected him by just giving him little things to read. Maybe he didn't know what the whole scheme was. I can't tell.
But in an interview, you say that I've read this, George Bush and Dick Cheney got Cipro on the day of 9/11 attacks in New York. I mean, they were already given Cipro, which is an antidote.
Yeah, either to prevent you from getting anthrax or to treat it. And White House staff, including both Cheney and George W. Bush, were treated with it on 9/11. That's absolutely true.
Right.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of the forensic evidence. Again, this is an FBI frame job. A guy by the name of Vincent B. Lisi handled it. I've been after him for years. We worked hard to discredit him as the FBI agent in charge of Boston, and then he went on to become security director at General Dynamics. We hounded him there. Apparently, he's left there, and lo and behold, he resurfaces right here in our backyard as the security director of Uber, of all things.
Oh, wow.
We're not through with them yet. I just wrote to Uber and I sent them my case file. And this is what's in the case file.
Really
the forensic evidence, Graeme. Although the FBI matched the genetic origin of the attack spores in Ivan's flask something known as RMR 1029, I think. The flask, within that flask, did not have the same silicon chemical fingerprint as the spores in the attack letters. And this implication is that the spores were taken out of the flask RMR 1029 and had been used to grow new spores for the mailing. So they were cloned. On April 22nd, 2010, the U.S. National Research Council, the operating arm of the National Academy of Sciences, convened a review committee of this evidence, and they heard testimony from Henry Hine, the microbiologist who was formerly employed at the Biodefense Lab in Maryland where Ivans worked. And he told the panel it was impossible that the deadly spores could have been produced undetected in Ivans' lab as maintained by the FBI. We can go on and on and on. None of it adds up. Right. So why was it ignored?
Why was it ignored? Well, you tell me. You're in the media. I mean, why did the media continually ignore such obvious things? It's obvious Bruce Ivans didn't do this. It's obvious it was an inside job. It was obvious that someone in the military-industrial complex, in collaboration with the executive branch, sent a weapon of mass destruction against Congress, the people's representatives. Why is that not a big deal? How many people even know that? I mean, this was highly weaponized anthrax. It could have killed Daschle or Leahy easily. So I don't know the answer to why people are ignoring it. I know that pressure continues. All of what you said is good. National Research Council did not support the FBI analysis in the end. There is also, though, just to make sure that you know it, the lawyers for 9/11 inquiry last year filed a petition to Congress, which you can find online, and it's on the anthrax attacks, and it's very detailed. It not only goes through all this stuff about the spores and where they actually came from, and shows that it wasn't Ivans, couldn't have been Ivans. It also has a whole bunch of attachments, including statements by Ivans' colleagues, such as Hine, saying why they're convinced it wasn't Bruce. He didn't do it, he couldn't do it, and so on. So, in theory, Congress has that now, but, what are they going to do with it? I don't know.
Well, one of the questions I had, and we only have about 3 minutes left with you, Professor Macqueen, is what has been the reaction to your findings? And I also know, I believe you said on the 9/11 Consensus Committee, and as far as the reports and final reports, could you briefly talk about the follow-up and what has developed since your publication?
On anthrax specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was involved in 9/11 investigation first, and that's what I'm doing again at the moment. But, well, it would be great to say the world changed after my book came out, but you know perfectly well that didn't happen. The book was not reviewed in any major place, as far as I know. There were lots of nice people on Amazon who said, hey, I like this book, but that's not quite good enough to get in the New York Times. I felt very satisfied that I had, to my satisfaction, sorted things out pretty well. I didn't try to name all the names, but I made a number of points very securely, and other people have built upon that since then. Since then, also, former FBI head of the investigation, Richard Lambert, came out and said that the FBI was sitting on what he called a wealth of exculpatory evidence, showing that Ivans wasn't guilty, and that they had this secret evidence which they had never released to Congress or to the people. So that's not caused by me, but it's a development that's fairly recent and very important.
Wonderful. Dr. Macqueen, we have a brief caller with a question. Go ahead, caller.
Hi, this is Jeff Wright on the Mendocino Coast, and thank you, Professor Macqueen, for your work. My question goes to, do you see any possible parallels, because we've heard rumors about COVID-19, and other aspects of what you've brought up of future Uber drivers being pre-vaccinated or prevented from getting something along the lines of anthrax, where people may be given Cipro ahead of time, and suddenly passengers will be dropping off because they've been exposed to whatever might be preventing the COVID-19 Gamma or Zulu version or whatever's next down the line. Do you see any parallels going on in possibilities of now? Because people are kept from meeting with each other, going to public meetings, etc., as you know and as you've outlined. Thank you very much for the topic.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It was kind of a complicated question, so I won't try to answer it all. But I see the essence of it as being, do I see any parallels between what happened in 2001 and what's going on right now? I do see some parallels. My old friend Kevin Ryan, we were co-editors of the Journal of 9/11 Story, 9/11, I can't even remember my own journal. Anyway, we were editors together some years. He's done some really good work on the parallels between the operations back then and what may be happening right now. Now, although I'm not an expert on what's happening right now, I'm deeply disturbed by several things that are happening. And one of them is, if you look at the databases from 3 regions that have a fairly good setup to collect bad reactions from vaccines. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay, so it's the VAERS system in the U.S., it's the yellow card system in the U.K., and there's another one in the European Union. When doctors find that a patient has had a bad reaction to this vaccine, they can submit a form, and they have done so. And according to those forms, 38,000 people have died thus far from this vaccine. Now, this is unheard of, and yet the pressure continues to get everyone, including children, vaccinated with this.
Wow.
I don't pretend to know why. I mean, I admit to being rather baffled, but this is very deep stuff going on here.
Yeah. Professor Macqueen, I'm so sorry we're out of time, but we do want to thank you for being our guest and perhaps have him back.
I just wanted to jump in and say the name of your journal is called the Journal of 9/11 Studies. It's that simple.
Thanks so much, John.
I also want to say is that your work is peer-reviewed.
Yes.
It meets the requirement for rigorous intellectual discipline.
Yeah.
These are excellent articles in your Journal of 9/11 Studies. And the next time you come back, we'll focus more on 9/11.
Thank you so much for being our guest today. Dr. Graeme Macqueen is the author of the book, The 2001 Anthrax Deception. And you can also, The Case for Domestic Conspiracy, He began his research back in 2006 on 9/11 and the subsequent anthrax attacks. Thank you again for being our guest.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.